Hello again, everybody. So this is Jeremy Weiss coming at you for the final big slideshow video presentation of Unit 3, our unit on distributive justice, here in Ethics 112 at Pikes Peak Community College in the spring of 2020. So a question, again, is what must a distribution of stuff, so primary social goods, say, be like if it is to be just? And we have our answer from Rawls that we've looked at extensively. Rawls says that each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive basic liberty compatible with a similar liberty for others. And insofar as is compatible with that first principle, he says that social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they're both, one, to the greatest benefit of the least advantage, and two, attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. Now, last time we contrasted Rawls's view with Nozick's. Right, Nozick says that the following principles kind of exhaustively characterize what justice amounts to or requires. It says, first, a person who acquires a holding in accordance with the principle of justice in acquisition is entitled to that holding. Second, a person who acquires a holding in accordance with the principle of justice in transfer from someone else entitled to the holding is entitled to that holding. And then three, a person who acquires a holding in accordance with the principle of the rectification of injustice in holdings is entitled to the holding. And finally, no one is entitled to a holding except by repeated applications of those three principles. Right, so these are the two big theories we've looked at so far, Rawls's and Nozick's. So Rawls's basic motivation for his theory, as we've talked about, is that a just society should be able to secure the consent or approval of every single person in that society. Not necessarily as those people actually are, but as they would be if they were being rational and unbiased, and were giving or withholding consent in conditions free from coercion or deception. And according to Rawls, people like that would only consent to or approve of societies that satisfied those principles A and B. And Nozick's basic motivation for his theory is quite different. His basic idea is that a distribution is just or unjust depending entirely on how it came about. Right? Just because it has a certain shape doesn't mean that it's just. What matters is how it was arrived at. So even if he gives the example of if you steal something from me, then just because I could have chosen voluntarily to give it to you, doesn't mean that those things are the same, right? It matters whether it was you're getting this thing from me was actually theft or actually a gift, right? And so Nozick's idea is that if a distribution is the result of a series of acquisitions, and each transaction in that sequence was free from things tantamount to theft or fraud, then that distribution is just. I think that's what we learned from the Wilt Chamberlain example. So if there's a series of moves that individually seem fair or okay, then no matter how things end up as a result of those moves, things are just. So here's some upshots of each, or one upshot of each, is that America is unjust. Colorado is unjust, Colorado Springs is unjust, and so is everywhere else in the world, probably. Right? But Nozick's theory of justice, in principle, is compatible with radical inequalities of wealth, income, opportunity, and so on, whereas Rawls probably is not. Right? Nozick doesn't think that the current world is unjust because it's so unequal. Right? Nozick's indifferent to that. Whereas Rawls, his main objection to the current distribution probably would be that it's so unequal. Right? The only way, in fact, in which equality even sort of enters into Nozick's picture is what we can think of as in a formal way. Right? That it's equal in the sense that what counts as just acquisition, transfer, or rectification will be the same for everyone. But he doesn't require much in the way of substantive equality between people and their material circumstances, right? And we can appeal here to a kind of important and well-known distinction between what we can call formal and substantive equality. So formal equality is the kind of stuff that, the law says that everybody has an opportunity to do X, right? That's a way in which everybody is formally equal. Whereas a more substantive picture of equality would have it so that like everybody actually has a real chance or a realistic shot at getting X. Right. One of my favorite illustrations of this distinction is in this nice pithy quote from Anatole France, where they say, the law, in its majestic equality, forbids the rich as well as the poor to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal bread. Right? Even though that rule, that law applies to both, right, it really is only ever going to be brought to bear on poor people. All right. Now, Rawls's view is very different from Nozick's, right? He starts from a baseline of substantive equality. Right? It's substantive inequalities that demand justification, and such inequalities are only justified when they maximize the position of those in the worst spot. Right? So Rawls kind of demands much more substantively equal society in terms of kind of material conditions, material circumstances, in terms of stuff, than Nozick does. Now, recently, you read a piece by Nielsen that argues that justice demands a much more substantively equal distribution, even than Rawls thinks. As he says, as Nielsen says, I want to explicate and defend an egalitarian conception of justice, both in production and in distribution, that's even more egalitarian than John Rawls' conception of justice. Right, so here's Nielsen over here. As we did with Rawls and Nozick, we'll include a picture of Nielsen when we include a new direct quote from him as a visual cue for you. You are welcome. So by the end of today, we will have discussed a defense of an economically right-wing theory of justice, right? That's Nozick. A defense of an economically left-wing theory of justice and distribution, that's Nielsen, who we'll talk about today. And a defense of a social democratic, or as we can put it, a more centrist theory of justice and distribution, and that's represented by Rawls. I've also uploaded a piece by a contemporary philosopher named Elizabeth Anderson, where she wrote it about 20 years ago. It's a piece called What is the Point of Equality? And I've added that to the recommended readings module on our D2L site. It's more difficult to place her view on the left to right spectrum than it was with the other three people we've read, but her discussion is very illuminating, and she touches on lots of fascinating equality-related issues that we just haven't had time to cover this term. And so if you're interested in this stuff and you want kind of a different perspective than any of the three we've looked at, you should totally check it out. All right, so Nielsen, at the beginning of his piece, presents what he calls four conceptualizations of social justice, which together articulate what the left takes social justice to be. So these four conceptualizations are not kind of individually, they're not the theories of distributive justice, but they're kind of principles that people that take themselves to be on the left think are important features of any good theory of social justice. So the first one is that justice in society as a whole ought to be understood as requiring that each person be treated with equal respect, irrespective of desert, and that each person be entitled to self-respect, irrespective of desert. So desert here means kind of what people deserve. And the basic idea of one is that people should be treated with respect. You don't have to earn respect, right? You don't have to deserve to be treated with respect. That should be the assumption and the baseline for everybody, that everybody gets treated with respect regardless of kind of what they have or haven't done. Excuse me. Second conceptualization is that justice in society as a whole ought to be understood as requiring that each person be so treated, such that we approach as close as we can to a condition where everyone will be equal in satisfaction and in such distress as is necessary for achieving our commonly accepted ends. Right? So we have these kind of general ends we all want to achieve, both individually and as a society, and we should try to make things as much as we can so that people have to kind of contribute equally and they get equal amounts out of their contributions. Third, conceptualization, justice in society as a whole ought to be understood as a complete equality of the overall level of benefits and burdens of each member of that society. Right? This is obviously very similar to conceptualization number 2, but it focuses on slightly different aspects. And finally, justice in society as a whole ought to be understood as a structuring of the institutions of society so that each person can, to the fullest extent compatible with all other people doing likewise, satisfy her or his genuine needs. All right, so these kind of are background, if you want to think about it as like assumptions that Nielsen is making, or that he thinks that everybody that recognizes themselves being on the left would take all 4 of these things to be important features of any theory of justice. And so Nielsen will try to present a theory that kind of captures what's right about these conceptualizations, gets rid of what's wrong about them, and provides more detail in the relevant points. So according to Nielsen, when egalitarians speak of equality, they should be understood as asserting that everyone is to be treated equally in certain respects, namely that there are certain conditions of life that should be theirs. Okay, so in some ways, we should all be treated equally if our society is to be just. Now, the idea is that all people have an equal right to the things that matter, not that everybody should have the same amount of the things that matter. Right? As Nielsen says, because talk of amounts doesn't always make sense, for example, in the case of respect. Okay, as he puts it, everyone has a right to respect, and to an equal respect, in that none can be treated as second-class people. But this does not mean that in treating them with respect, you treat them in an identical way. This is going to be a very, very important distinction, right? The distinction between respecting people equally and treating them in the same ways. Okay, so